There we go. Okay. Perfect. I'll turn it over to Steph. Thanks so much for being with us, Steph.
So yeah, I just want to start by extending my gratitude to Doug for dealing with all of the tech, but mainly for inviting me to come and speak to you. Over the last couple of years, chances to come and share your research have been scarce, so it's nice to get back out and speak to people. As Doug said, I've recently completed my PhD here at Cambridge over in the history faculty. I graduated last from Cummins 5 back in February, and today I'm going to share a little bit of that PhD research with you, and then we're going to talk about the first chapter of my thesis. So today I'm going to talk to you about the legal identity of women and the clergy in the prosecution of homicide. So we're going to be thinking about women and clergy as suspects of homicide. Firstly, I'm going to say a little bit about the historiography of medieval crime. Then I will talk you through my sources, and then we will get on to talking about legal identity. First, and then finally, by looking at women. So the key aim of my thesis was to re-engage with the socio-legal approach to the records of the King's Court of Common Law, an approach that was pioneered in the 1970s by Barbara Hanwalt and James Buchanan Gibbon. Both of these works sought to uncover patterns of crime and to profile the typical medieval criminal. For the first time, we saw roles of the common law courts being used within their historical context as a source for social and economic history in order to study the lives of ordinary people. With this new set of research questions, it meant that fresh methodologies were needed. As a consequence, these studies borrowed their concepts, methods, and techniques from methods that were first developed in the social sciences. Quantitative methods and statistics were combined with criminological, anthropological, social and sociological perspectives, which enabled socio-legal historians to contribute to the growing trend of history from below. However, this led to some hostility within the field of medieval law. Proponents of traditional legal history rejected the new socio-legal scholarship, stating that it used radical approaches and that it was perceived as a threat to the rigour of the discipline. And some of these criticisms must be heeded, mainly that we cannot naively assume that medieval legal records allow historians to quantify crime rates. These roles are not a perfect window onto medieval crime. It is not as simple as reading a few thousand cases and emerging with clean statistics on how much crime there was, when it happened, or who did it. Calculating medieval crime rates is a near impossible task due to missing records, multiple jurisdictions, and the politics of law. In other words, has crime actually gone up, or has there just been a lot of commissions issued? And all of these problems are then coupled with unreliable population data. This first wave of scholarship from the 1970s were heavily criticised for using these records to construct the profile of a typical criminal, making bold claims such as most murders happened in summer, most murders happened at night, or most murders were committed by men. And there are a few problems with these claims. Legal records only allow the historian to study unsuccessful criminals. J.B. Post maintained that the typical medieval criminal was never caught. I'd push that further and say that when studying crime, discretionary power must be considered. That is, whether to use the law against a suspect. Discretion applied at all stages by all people. And finally, we cannot use these records to create criminal profiles because of the 2 points that I've just mentioned. But also, the medievalist has to bear in mind that the majority of suspects showing up in the coroner's rolls will never be convicted. A high percentage of the people named by the coroner chose to flee and thus did not face trial. And even when we get to the jail delivery rolls, the records where the trial takes place, between 80 to 90% of medieval suspects tried for felony were in fact acquitted. Now, due to the criticism by legal historians, these quantitative studies of medieval crime fell out of fashion. Nevertheless, since the turn of the century, we've seen a second wave of socio-legal studies starting to emerge. Some great work has been done by people such as Sarah Butler and Kenneth Duggan, among others. This second wave of scholarship heeded past advice about crime rates and criminal profiling, and instead advanced the methodology with more targeted questions. We can still study crime, we just need to recognise the limitations of our sources and ask appropriate questions. So now I'll talk through the records that I'm using. Should be appearing on the screen. So
well, let's not assume anything just said. It's appearing on my screen, which is not helpful for this. Okay, let me try this. Stuck on this. Sorry, everybody. Just bear with us. Fantastic.
Okay. So there are two key records that underpin my research. Firstly, the Just Two collection. These are the coroner's rolls. Now, the medieval coroner had a diverse range of duties, but today we're going to concentrate on the role that's most familiar to us, investigating deaths. So when a sudden or unnatural death occurred, the medieval coroner would be called, and in turn he would summon a jury and they would hold an inquest over the body. If the jury ruled that it was a case of homicide rather than an accidental or natural death, they would then name a suspect who would be arrested and have their chattels seized. And the second source that I use is sort of the next step in the process, the Just Three collection, which is the records of jail delivery. And all this means is that these are records of the trial that took place in the county jail. These records are often overlooked because they contain very little detail, and they're not as close to the crime as the coroner's rolls. But following the decline of the general area, jail delivery was the principal method for prosecuting crime in localities. The key conceptual difference between the medieval prison and its modern counterparts is that it's predominantly a site of pre-trial custody rather than post-trial punishment. The King's justices would arrive at the jail and then they would try or deliver all of the prisoners. So the prisoners were brought out to face trial, and then at the end, the jail was empty. As I said, these records have been overlooked by many historians because they do not contain a lot of detail. Typically, they only say who is being tried, what for, and then at the end state the verdict. There are exceptions where we get a little more detail, but the bulk of them are very sparse. But we only use the coroner's records, so the indictments. We're missing the verdicts and the punishments which jail delivery provide us. So this is why I decided to use two sources together. Both of these are held at the National Archives in Kew, and they are available online via AAFT, which I've been immensely grateful completing a PhD in the middle of a global pandemic. So I've managed to review all of the jail delivery and coroner's rolls for the period 1345 to 1385 for the city and county of York and 3 Yorkshire ridings. Due to a combination of a good level of extant material and due to the sheer scale of Yorkshire, I've been able to select a large number of cases. My database contains over 6,000 suspects and victims from almost 2,500 cases. So my work argues that the medieval coroner's inquests and the trial records should be treated as fictive, and this is for two reasons. Firstly, in the absence of modern forensics and surveillance, the only people who often knew the truth of the matter were the killer and the victim. The deceased was unable to tell their story, and the murderer had no incentive to admit their guilt because the punishment was a capital sentence. Thus, in most cases, the community had to assume what had taken place. And these assumptions could be based on circumstantial evidence. They could be shaped by prejudice or suspicion of certain people or certain groups. And secondly, the community had to deliberate whether the homicide was so heinous that it warranted death. If not, the jury would have to decide whether they were prepared to acquit the defendant or whether they would present mitigating circumstances in order to secure a pardon. Due to all of this, the court rules cannot necessarily be used for crime rates and criminal profiling, but they can shed light on socio-cultural views of criminality and the legal responses to crime, from indictment to trial to punishment. So the focus of today's talk is going to be legal identity. Doug, could I have the next slide? While legal identity is a modern term, the experiences that it describes would be recognised by contemporaries in late medieval England. People have the potential to be treated differently when interacting with the law in late medieval England based on their legal identity. A person's legal identity shaped their entire experience of the law, from whether they could perform a judicial role or bring a suit, to whom could prosecute them and how they could be punished. Now, a free layman would have had virtually unrestricted access to the common law. Medieval men were able to represent themselves in court and initiate legal action. Furthermore, before the age of a professional police force, the men in the community played an essential role in reporting and investigating crime. In theory, a man could hold any legal office, although there were sometimes socio-economic barriers, such as landholding requirements. Nevertheless, the fundamental point here is that men in late medieval England dominated local and royal law enforcement, and they were often required to participate in a legal role. However, there are two groups who had a very different legal identity to laymen: the clergy and women. At 12 years old, every lay male was sworn into a tithing group where they were responsible for policing each other's behaviour. As outlined by Philip Schofield, women and clergy were exempt from these tithing groups. Likewise, the legal identity of laymen granted them access to judicial violence in the form of the ability to pass capital and corporal sentences. Clergymen were unable to pass or receive sentences of blood. Women were not allowed to pass sentences of any kind, so as a result, they were excluded from exercising judicial violence. Philippa Madden explained that the power to judge and execute descended from God to kings, and kings in turn delegated this authority to their judges. The logical conclusion of this idea is that the right to perform violence is heavily gendered. As summarised by Madden, it was unthinkable that a woman could lay claim to such godly authority. But there are two key modifiers to legal identity that need to be considered when thinking about homicide suspects. This is benefit of clergy for clerics and coverture for women. So first we will turn to the clergy. The ability to claim benefit of clergy meant that any clerk accused of felony could request to be transferred to an ecclesiastical court for trial and any subsequent punishment. The main advantage of this legal right was that the church could not pass sentences of blood, and therefore a guilty cleric would escape execution. The legal anomaly of benefited clergy had caused a clash between secular and religious spheres. It was one of the key disagreements between Henry II and Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, culminating in the death of the latter in 1170. Henry thought that it was unjust that clergymen who were found guilty were able to escape royal punishment. In contrast, Becket did not see benefit of clergy as an immunity. Instead, he thought it protected clerks from being punished twice, by the bishop and by the king. Now, medieval clerical identity was theoretically male in its definition, because prior to the 17th century, the law did not allow women to access benefited clergy. Sarah Butler argued that the male nature of benefited clergy was due to the cloistering of religious women. Nuns cannot commit public crimes because they do not lead public lives. However, this doesn't explain why monks would have been able to use benefit of clergy, nor does it shed any light towards what would happen to a felonious nun. Pollock and Maitland outlined that while nuns were not technically able to claim clergy under the common law, they were still exempt from temporal justice. They cited an example of a woman being claimed by the bishop's ordinary. So in my research, I have classified people as clergy based on how they were described in the court rolls, either simply appearing as clericus or with a full job title, for example, the rector of St. Edward in Walmgate, York. All of the clergy that I have found have male names. Therefore, the questions surrounding religious women cannot be addressed, only to say that no women attempted to claim benefit of clergy in Yorkshire from 1345 to 85. So what benefits actually came with claiming clergy? Legal scholars have suggested that the privilege of benefit of clergy placed clerics beyond the reaches of royal justice and forced the king to surrender some of his authority. Moreover, it has been argued that the plea of clergy encroached upon and mitigated the scope of the Crown's power of pardon. Benefit of clergy has been defined as the exemption enjoyed by churchmen from the criminal jurisdiction of the secular courts. It has even been suggested that benefit of clergy resulted in a clerical immunity, which meant that clerks were exempted from criminal responsibility. C.B. Firth has suggested that before the late 15th century, even the trials of clergymen were not conducted in secular courts. However, clergy do appear as suspects of homicide in Yorkshire. If we go to the next slide, we can see of Stephen de Burton, who's described as capellanus. He was indicted for killing the vicar of the Church of St. Lawrence in York. This example shows that the coroner could clearly deal with a case that not only had a clerical suspect, but also had a clerical victim. And this entry also reveals that the chattels of Stephen were to be seized. Contrary to the notion that the church dealt with the trials of clergymen, they also appear in the jail delivery rolls when the trials took place in the county jail. Go to the next slide, we can see Hugh, the vicar of the Church of Rockingham, who was tried alongside Juliana, the wife of John Wink, for feloniously killing the said John Wink. And this took place in 1347. Thus, the idea of clerical immunity must not be overstated. Clergymen were treated the same as the laity until a guilty verdict. Clerics suspected of committing a felony were to be arrested by secular authorities, held in county jails, tried before royal justices, and finally a lay jury would determine their guilt. Furthermore, as with lay felons, the king's officials would seize the chattels of clerks who were indicted for a felony. Yet, sentencing is where this comparable treatment ends. Benefit of clergy meant that clerks could not be subjected to capital or corporal punishment. Benefit of clergy did allow felonious clerks who invoked this privilege to be transferred to the bishop's jail after being convicted by a lay jury at the county jail. Thus, it did shield them from royal punishment, if not from royal justice. But despite having benefit of clergy, most clerks tried for homicide in 14th century Yorkshire did not invoke this privilege. This is because the clergyman would only need to invoke their privilege if they were found guilty. In stating that they wanted to claim benefit of clergy, it would mean that the cleric was spared execution and was transferred to an ecclesiastical prison. Due to the high acquittal rate in medieval England, most clerical cases followed the regular legal process, that is, trial by jury, a verdict of not culpable, and the release of the defendant without the need to use their legal identity. However, as shown on this graph, a higher percentage of clerical rather than lay defendants were convicted for homicide at the Yorkshire jail deliveries. Now, Milsom has suggested that clerics were more likely to be convicted because they could claim benefit of clergy. In other words, a sympathetic jury may choose to acquit a layman or woman who they believed to be guilty because they thought the resulting punishment was too harsh, whereas they knew a clerk could escape execution. It has even been stated that the clerical conviction rate reflects the real conviction rate. For instance, Milsom attributed the high medieval acquittal rates to juries exonerating those who did not deserve to lose their lives. He explained that if the fact could not shape the law will shape the facts. This was an age where even so-called decent citizens were involved in fights. Most people routinely carried a knife or a staff. Moreover, poor medical techniques meant that sometimes death could arise from even the smallest wounds. The argument is that pious juries would spare those whose crimes were understandable, as they felt that they did not deserve to die. Due to the fact that the clergy could not face this outcome, it's been argued that the jury would be more likely to convict them. The question of what benefit of clergy meant in this period is essential in order to assess whether the clergy still had a distinct legal identity. To compare the experiences of men, women, and clergy, it is necessary to understand who could access benefit of clergy. Therefore, the key question is whether the legal identity of clergy had in fact become a legal fiction by the late Middle Ages, as has been argued for the early modern period. That is to say, whether benefit of clergy was still a clerical privilege, or whether it was now in fact available to all men. If it was open to laymen, the premise that it was a clerical privilege would be fictional. In order to understand whether benefit of clergy was a clerical privilege or a masculine privilege, whether it was available to clergy or all men, we need to know how benefit of clergy functioned in 14th century England. Now, Garth Walker has argued that the early modern English judicial system gave male convicts an advantage over their female counterparts prior to the 17th century because only men could claim benefit of clergy. This conclusion cannot automatically be applied to the 14th century due to changes in the law. After 1512, if a killing was done with no malice and it was a first offence, then it was clergyable. In other words, if a layman was convicted of manslaughter, he could plead benefit of clergy. The punishment for an early modern cleric found guilty of manslaughter was branding with an N on their thumb with a hot iron. As a layman could claim the privilege of benefit of clergy for manslaughter after 1512, it is clear that benefit of clergy had become largely a legal fiction. Additionally, Walker argues that as a result, gender affected judicial outcomes. Walker did not find any women convicted of manslaughter in her study of early modern Cheshire, and argues this is because a woman could not claim the benefit of clergy. Due to this restriction, the sentence for a woman convicted of manslaughter would be the same as one convicted of murder. Thus, a mitigation would have made no difference to her sentence. This may help to explain why a pious jury would not reduce the charge, even if they sympathised with a female convict. However, it does not explain why there were no genuine cases of female perpetrated manslaughter in Walker's data. So for my study, the main question that needs to be answered is whether men had an unfair advantage in 14th century due to benefit of clergy. In order to argue that women were at a disadvantage, it must be shown that laymen were also able to use benefit of clergy. While, as shown by Walker, this argument can certainly be applied to early modern England, it is not a foregone conclusion that benefit of clergy had become a legal fiction by the 14th century. In the Yorkshire jail delivery rolls, there is a case where a male and female defendant received a different outcome. The case on the screen is from 1346. Here we see Hugh de Nuttall and Lucy, his concubine, being tried at York Castle. This entry explains that Hugh, Lucy and others had robbed all summer. However, here, Hugh and Lucy are being tried for killing an unknown merchant. The jury decided that Hugh and Lucy were both guilty of this crime, yet Hugh was able to enter a plea of clergy and was transferred to the prison of the bishop. Lucy was unable to do the same, and she was sentenced to hang. The process of how benefit of clergy is tested and granted needs to be assessed to gauge how easy it was to obtain this privilege. The crucial point relates to the reasons why Hugh received a more favourable outcome than Lucy. Was it because he was male, or was it because he was a clergyman? Prior to the period covered by this study, a defendant wishing to claim benefit of clergy would have to appear in the clerical habit and tonsure, and then they would need to be claimed by a representative of the bishop. It is widely acknowledged that from the mid-14th century, reading became the standard test for benefit of clergy. It has been argued that as a result of this reading test, benefit of clergy was extended de facto to all literate men. It has even been said that the reading test was the final stage in the secularization of the clericus plea. However, this raises the question, if it was so easy to claim benefit of clergy, why all men did not do so. In this 40-year period, in 14th century Yorkshire, only 10 men actually pleaded benefit of clergy. Hence, if this privilege was subject to misuse in 14th century Yorkshire, the abuse does not appear to have been widespread. 8 of these men were recorded as clergy the first time that they are named in the entry. It is impossible to reconstruct the transcript of the trial, thus it cannot be known whether clerical status was It cannot be known when clerical status was first mentioned, but it perhaps seems more credible when it was recorded right at the start of the entry and not only appearing after the person had been found culpable. In this case of Hugh de Nuttall, This is an example of clerical identity appearing later in the entry. He's first introduced, we're not told that he's a clergyman, and then later he goes on to plead benefit of clergy. Consequently, the authenticity of Hugh's clerical status could be questioned. First, he was simply named as Hugh de Nuttall, rather than, for instance, Hugh de Nuttall clericus. 8 out of the 10 men claiming benefit of clergy were identified as such when they were first named in the role. Example, William de Coates, Capellanus, or Thomas de Highgate, clericus. Nevertheless, it is not proof that Hugh entered a false plea, nor does it legitimise the other 8 men as they could have lied from the very beginning of their trial. It is difficult to know whether the court scribe did not bother to include Hugh's status elsewhere in the entry, or whether this clerical status was an invention when he realised that he would be found culpable. Even if one were to assume that all 10 of these pleas of clergy were fictional, they represent less than 1% of all homicide cases with a verdict. Likewise, Charles Buchanan Gibbon found that only 1% of homicide suspects in 13th century England used the privilege of benefit clergy. It must be stated that these figures are skewed by the very high acquittal rate. Therefore, it's more representative to consider those pleading clergy as a percentage of those who were found guilty rather than a percentage of all suspects. When applying this methodology, those pleading clergy still only made up 5% of those who were not acquitted in Yorkshire. Now, it is possible that one would not expect to see widespread abuse of benefit of clergy because the defendant was required to pass a reading test in an age when literacy was uncommon. However, while reading was no means universal, the notion that literacy was limited to the clergy and the highest levels of society has been rejected. Moreover, as noted by Alison McCarty, literate is an inexact term. The minimum skill required to pass the reading test could have been acquired while in prison awaiting trial. Although the justices were able to choose a section of text at random, it had become customary to ask the prisoner to read the first verse of the 51st Psalm, which became known as the neck verse. Therefore, it is indeed possible that prisoners could memorize the wording. It is evident that this was a concern because it was an indictable offence to teach prisoners to read so that they could claim clergy. For example, a vicar from Canterbury was indicted in 1383 for instructing an unknown criminal. A further insight on how easy or not it was for a layman to claim benefit for clergy, we must return to the jail delivery rolls to examine how this process actually worked in practice. In the case of Hugh de Nuttall, there was a representative of the Archbishop at the trial. It has been argued that the role of the representative was to oversee the reading test, answering the question legit ut clericus. Newman F. Baker stated that the ordinary must answer with the formal words legit or non-legit, while neither of these words nor the mention of this specific reading test appear in this entry, it is recorded that there was a diligent examination. Nonetheless, the fact that the bishop's ordinary or another representative had to approve pleas of clergy appears to suggest that the process was tightly controlled. It could be suggested that the ordinary was merely judging whether the defendant could read, rather than vouching that he was a known cleric. However, the representative at the trial of Hugh and Lucy claimed He claimed Hugh as his clerk. Being recognised as a clerk by the bishop's representative was merely one of the hurdles that any layman attempting to claim clergy needed to overcome. Even after passing the reading test and being accepted by the ordinary, the defendant was not yet free to go. Unlike in early modern England, where the cleric would be branded and released, claiming benefit of clergy in the Middle Ages saw the prisoner transferred to the prison of the bishop to be tried by the bishop and his deputy. The procedure in the ecclesiastical courts has been described as little better than a farce. However, this comment seems to be based on the church's use of convocation, wherein a subject swore that he was innocent and 12 other men swore that they believed him. While a system of oath swearing may be seen as naive in the 12th century, in the 21st century, it was by no means unique to ecclesiastical trials and was still being used in local courts. In fact, felonious clerks faced a lengthy process after being claimed by the bishop. They would be held in his prison. The bishop was organising an inquest made up of clergymen to investigate the clerk's conduct. Those involved in the inquest would have prior knowledge of the man and would determine whether he had committed the crime. If he was found to be innocent, a proclamation would be made asking if anyone objected to the clerk undergoing convocation. Those who did object had the chance to prove that he was guilty. If the cleric passed all of the stages, they would undergo purgation, where they would swear an oath that they were innocent, along with a number of clerics swearing that they believed him. In order to pass as a member of the clergy, the layman would not only have to complete a successful reading test, submit to ecclesiastical investigation and congregation, but would have to do all this presumably without raising the suspicion that they were not a cleric. While it would be foolish to ignore negligence or corruption, there is certainly evidence to suggest vigilance on the part of the ecclesiastical officials to safeguard their privilege. It seems unlikely that a layman would be able to navigate so many controls and make a successful fraudulent claim for the benefit of clergy. This study cannot categorically rule out that this was impossible. However, it offers caution against the notion that benefit of clergy had become a legal fiction and that it was possible for any literate or coached man to obtain it. Getting to the legal identity of women. As Pollock and Maitland famously stated, the law gives a woman no rights and asks of her no duties. It has even been said that there was no place for a woman in the law. There has always been an awareness that women were treated and viewed differently. Statements by Pollock and Maitland have set the tone for a long time. It has been stated that women ceased to have legal status upon marriage. And it is certainly true that a woman's legal identity changed once married. The custom of coverture meant that a husband and wife were one person at law. So all civil litigation of a married woman had to include her husband. Common law lawyers have termed coverture as a civil death, where the woman became Mrs. Man or Mrs. Him, with his identity covering hers. Since the turn of the century, revisionist scholarship has sought to write women back into legal history through studies of female legal knowledge and agency. Even so, this historiographical focus has overwhelmingly been on civil matters. And it is surprising that more attention has not been paid to women and crime. How does this principle of coverture affect criminal matters? Is coverture a get-out-of-jail-free card? Now, there is always a small number of women compared to men listed as suspects in homicide cases. and a small number of women means an even smaller number of wives. In the coroner's rolls across this 40-year period, there was only one female sole suspect recorded as a wife. By sole suspect, I mean that she was the only person indicted for this offence. Although we have a wife indicted alone, the victim was her husband. As this woman was indicted for killing her husband, it is impossible to examine the role played by coverture. Her husband, of course, could not be indicted alongside her. Upon the death of her husband, even though she was described as a wife, her legal status would be that of a widow. There were 10 women described as wives among the co-suspects in the coroner's rolls. Co-suspects are defined as people indicted in the same entry for the same offence. For example, John, son of Thomas of Gretham, and Alice, his wife, were indicted for feloniously killing Lucy Looper of Stokesley on the 5th of January 1347. This case certainly seems to suggest that the jury thought both John and Alice were responsible for killing Lucy. However, it cannot be completely ruled out that Thomas was named alongside his wife for her crime. A total of 7 female co-suspects appeared with their husbands in the coroner's rolls. Additionally, 2 wives were indicted alongside others for killing their husbands. However, the final married female co-suspect in the coroner's rolls was indicted alongside her husband.
Do we know how to go backwards?
Okay, move that on to the case that I'm going to talk about. Ignore this case for now, just the next case. So the final married female co-suspect in the coroner's rolls was neither indicted alongside her husband, nor was she charged with killing him. In 1360, Isabella, the wife of Nicholas Stelwerk of York, was indicted together with her sister and John of Ockley for feloniously killing a chaplain. Although Isabella is referred to as being married, her husband is not indicted alongside his wife. As Isabella was indicted without her husband, one could question whether he was still alive at the time. It is possible that Isabella was known as wife of Nicholas, even though he was deceased. However, the same entry, which you can't see, reports that the crime took place in the house of Nicholas. Now, if Nicholas owned the house, this strongly suggests that he was alive at the time of the indictment, and therefore Isabella, a married woman with a living husband, was indicted for homicide without him, which highlights that coverage did not protect married women from criminal prosecution. This is contrary to civil matters, where a wife could not sue or be sued in her own right, but had to be accompanied in litigation by her husband. So it is clear that a woman could not be indicted. It's clear that a married woman could be indicted by a coroner's jury, but could a married woman face trial without her husband? This case. So at the Yorkshire jail deliveries from 1345 to 1385, of the married women on trial, 5 were indicted for killing their husband, 3 were tried for killing with their husband. However, another 6 women were described as wives. All 6 of these women were indicted without their husbands. This example on the screen shows the case of Matilda, wife of William Smith of Allerton by the Water, standing trial for homicide alone. Again, it could be argued that Matilda does not necessarily have a living husband, even though she's described as a wife. However, this entry shows that she was indicted for killing the servant of William Smith, her husband. If William was able to have a servant, again, it suggests that he is alive. These cases demonstrate that married women could be indicted and face trial without their husband. But perhaps this is expected. After all, a husband would not be punished for his wife's offence when the punishment was physical. We, of course, would not expect a husband to be hanged because his wife had killed someone. So why would he be named alongside her? But what about when the punishment was economic? Felons were required to forfeit their possessions to the Crown. But what about married female felons? John Baker has explained that by the 13th century, any property which a wife had owned as a femme sole became the husband's upon marriage. And English law was unique in this respect. Amy Erickson has outlined that in pre-modern Europe, a husband controlled the property that she brought into marriage, as well as any property that they jointly acquired after the marriage, but he did not own it. In England, on the other hand, a husband took ownership of his wife's property.
Personal property.
Yes. Krista Castlereagh has written about married women's property and said that their property could not be. Krista Castlereagh has written about married women, stating that they are liable for punishment for their husband's crimes, being stripped of much, if not all, of the family property. Yet, whether in practice coverture prevented a seizure of chattels in a case where a married female suspect was indicted without her husband still requires investigation. To assist with this question, the Yorkshire coroner's rolls contain 6 female suspects who were recorded as owning chattels. Firstly, Agnes of Southwell was indicted for feloniously killing John of Southwell at night on the Friday before the feast of Matthew the Apostle in 1360. Agnes's chattels were valued at 10 shillings. That's not, don't look at the screen yet. This is the next case. The record does not shed any light on the relationship between Agnes and John, if there was one. However, Agnes is not described as a wife, so it could be assumed with some degree of certainty that she was unmarried. As a single woman, Agnes was subject to forfeiture of property when she committed a felony, just as a man would have been. Therefore, the standard legal process was followed, and Agnes's chattels were documented by the coroner. The next female suspect was indicted for the murder of her husband, so again, like Agnes, would have been treated as a single woman. The remaining 4 suspects, who had chattels and were all listed as married, were indicted alongside their husbands. As both the husband and wife were named as co-suspects, these entries do not provide a conclusive answer on the question of whether her legal identity would have prevented the chattels from being seized. However, it is striking in each of these entries that the scribe assigned the chattels as property of both the husband and the wife, not just the husband. For example, when Robert and his wife Joan were named as suspects for killing John in 1372, both of their names were recorded in relation to the chattel. The entry reads that the chattels of the aforementioned Robert and Joan were valued at 40 shillings. Likewise, in 1363, John Delmore and his wife Joan were documented as homicide suspects, and when recording the chattels, which were valued at 24 shillings, the plural eorum, or theirs, was used to refer back to John and Joan, implying that they both owned the goods. in 1364, when a husband and wife, Richard and Alice, were named as murder suspects. The scribe initially assigned the chattels to Richard, but Alice's name was then added in superscript, which is the case at the bottom of the screen. The fact that Alice was initially forgotten may speak towards social attitudes towards women and property ownership. Alternatively, it could be an honest scribal error. However, the fact that the record was corrected adds weight to the legal position of married women having partial ownership, but not control over their possessions. These cases seem to present a contradiction to traditional legal scholarship, which maintained that coverture, in the form of the husband owning his wife's possessions, was a social reality. Nevertheless, there is no way to tell whether these chattels would have been taken if the husband was not also indicted. In the case of Isabella, the wife of Nicholas Delwerk of York, who was indicted without her husband, it shows Isabella's chattels were recorded as null. She had no chattels. This could be the legal fiction of coverture. Conceivably, Isabella had no chattels because they belonged to her husband. Alternatively, it is feasible that the couple just did not have any possessions. This is not uncommon. 68% of the male suspects were recorded as having no chattels. So a firm conclusion on forfeiture and coverture perhaps remains out of reach with this current data. It can, however, be said that there is no evidence of a married woman having her chattels seized unless her husband was also party to the crime. And it remains credible that the legal identity of a married woman protected their goods from felony forfeiture. So, a few concluding thoughts. We've seen that clergymen were not treated as a separate legal identity in any of the previous socio-legal studies. In the work from the 1970s, the discussion on clergy was limited to the prevalence of certain occupations rather than recognising the distinct legal status of clergymen. My study spells out the experience of the criminal clerk and has emphasised that while safe from execution, medieval clergy did have to engage with both common and customary law. It is vital to have a full understanding of how benefit of clergy worked in practice. A full and widespread understanding of benefit of clergy guards against some of the hyperbole concerning clerical immunity and prevents any misunderstandings of the limits of benefit of clergy. We have seen that despite the introduction of the reading test in the 14th century, the court rolls do not support the argument that any man could claim benefits of clergy. A representative of the bishop had to recognise the defendant as his clerk. Benefit of clergy was still a clerical right in the 14th century and had not yet become a male privilege. While all clergy were men, not all men could claim benefit of clergy. We have seen that women of any marital status were personally liable for their violent actions. Thus, as coverture did not appear to apply in cases of violence committed by women, this has huge ramifications for how historians conceptualise coverture. Recent scholarship has been eager to prove that medieval women did have legal knowledge and were capable of litigating. If one looks at criminal matters, it does not seem that the legal capabilities of women were ever in question, at least not in the way that has been framed in discussions of civil cases. Married women could be accused of homicide, then indicted, arrested, held in jail, tried, and executed. These women were expected to defend themselves, not led by a husband or a male relative. Also, the stakes were highest in cases of felony. If someone was found liable in a case which fell under the purview of coverture, the consequences were often just financial. In opposition, for felonies, the defendant could lose their life. This reminds the historian of the original purpose of coverture, which, although this may have been an indirect consequence, it was not necessarily designed to oppress women. The primary concern behind the doctrine of coverture, as with primogeniture, was protecting the wealth of the family. While a woman could lose her life as a result of a felony trial, she theoretically could not lose family wealth or land. However, what is striking is that in the cases where a husband and wife were indicted together as co-suspects, the scribe uses the plural eorum when recording the chattels. The goods are not his, the goods are theirs. This evidence appears to contradict the strict legal position of coverture, which states that married women did not own chattels. It is possible that this evidence highlights that under criminal matters, women could be seen as possessing movable property. Alternatively, it is equally possible that legally these chattels were still owned and controlled by the husband, but instead the use of the plural represents that society considered such good to be property of the couple, not the husband. The fact that different legal identities existed shows that not everyone was treated equally before the law. Laymen, women, and clergymen had distinct legal identities and thus experienced different rights, privileges, or restrictions. Therefore, legal history must be intersectional, considering the experiences of all identities rather than a one-size-fits-all approach. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steph. That was absolutely fantastic. A lot of really fascinating information there. I will turn over to the audience in the room first for questions, and then we can go to our online attendees. And if I can just abuse my privilege and ask the first one, I think I will. You had mentioned Milsom arguing that the ability to escape punishment for clerical figures might have affected conviction rates. Is that something that you agree with based on what you'd seen in your research? Is that the same kind of feeling you had received, or do you have a potential alternative?
Yeah, I mean, the sort of elephant in the room on that is that there is a legal option if you don't think that the person deserves death in the form of royal pardons. The acquittal rate is extortionately high, 80 to 90%. I think it probably has more to do with difficulty in proving that they're guilty rather than all being about a pious jury, because yeah, we have benefit of clergymen, but we have pardons. The jury could tell a story of self-defense. When these appear, they are very formulaic. They sort of relay the same story about the attacker striking first, and then the person who's eventually ended up as the murderer was unable to flee, that they were trapped, and that they acted in defence and salvation of their life. So we see this very formulaic narrative trotted out in cases where the jury want to recommend a pardon. So there is another legal option. You don't simply have to condemn or convict. So I would say very high acquittal rate is more explained by the fact that they couldn't prove it.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions in the audience, David?
So when you're counting something as being found guilty, does that include the cases where they're found guilty after a plea of self-defence, which will be followed by a pardon and vacation?
So for the graph that I put up today, that was acquittal versus not acquittal. So yes, I'm counting people who were acquitted versus everyone else. In my thesis, there's other graphs that break down and then look at what happened to the people who were not acquitted, and then it deals with the people who were executed and the people who were pardoned, and the people who paid benefit of clergy separately.
So do you find a different pardon rate for women and men?
Yes. For a 40-year period, I have not found a single example of a woman being pardoned, which I had to frantically check whether it was possible for a woman to receive a pardon, and it's fully possible, but I don't have any examples. And the reason for that, I think, is that all the pardons I have this self-defence narrative in them, and self-defence is very gendered. It's about male honour and standing up for yourself, defending yourself. And there's an argument that if a woman was to invoke a tale of self-defence, it would harm rather than mitigate her story. If a woman was able to take down usually a male attacker through self-defence, there would be a suggestion that she had used stealth or she'd snuck up on him. It wouldn't be sort of an equal proportional force.
I was just wondering about children. Do they turn up at all, or would you be able to know if a child was?
In theory, you'd think that it would be noteworthy. I can't say that they definitely don't. I can say that I have no evidence of children, or at least younger people. I don't have any ages of people being recorded, so I don't know how old they are. Some of the coroner's rolls from Cambridgeshire include people's ages. I haven't seen anyone young in that. They tend to be quite old compared to sort of modern criminology, 30s, 40s. No children. I don't even have any cases of infanticide, so no children as victims either.
But is there a legal way of dealing with children, or would everyone be treated? Or is there like an age limit where you can't do?
Yes, there will be. I'm looking at the lawyers in the room.
Discussed in the 14th century law records, yes. And there certainly are 14th century records where ages are mentioned and are significant. Could I, and before I ask the question, I'd just say that I thought what you found about women possibly being regarded as owning chattels jointly with the husband is fascinating and deserves a wider study, I think, to see whether possibly they thought of it in the same way as land, because there, of course, the husband only has control of the wife's land. He can't alienate it beyond his lifetime. There's no reason why they shouldn't have thought of chattels in the same way, because that it couldn't arise in a civil case because of the need to join the husband, whichever way they were suing. So it doesn't affect the law of property in any way in which it can be tested civilly. It occurred to me that it can arise in relation to forfeiture. It's an extremely interesting question. But I had two questions really. One concerned women. Do you find many or any examples of pregnancy being pleaded? Is that a common way out for women at this stage as it became later?
No, again, through this 40-year period, both of them do coroner's rolls, and probably come up more in jail delivery, but no, I haven't got a single example of a woman pleading with any.
And well, the other question concerned the test of clergy, where it seems to me that the role of the ordinary isn't significant, as perhaps you hinted, because even 200 years later, the ordinary has to claim a clerk, but by then he has to do what the judge tells him or he gets fined. But it's a procedure you have to follow, so it'll look exactly the same on the record, whether it's a genuine decision or not. What the law reports in the 14th century seem to suggest is that at least as late as the 1350s, the judges are still insisting on tonsure and clerical dress and so forth. They're quite strict. And then there's a silence in the law reports that I've looked at, tried very hard to find when it changes. By the middle of the 14th century, it's completely different, and reading is the only thing that matters. And it's clear from the statute you mentioned about branding that it has become common, because real clerks are actually exempted from branding. So the statute itself demonstrates that it's dealing with lay people. But I think I heard you said that you thought it was customary to assign the neck verse in the 14th century, but there's no evidence of that, is there?
that's, I'm getting that from the historiography. As I said in my example from jail delivery, there's no mention of a reading test. It just says a diligent examination. Don't know what that is. We might assume that that was a reading test, but if the law reports are suggesting once you're in clerical dress, perhaps.
Well, there's a difference between a reading test and a, not exactly a fictionalised, but not very real reading test, and knowing that we always assign the same test. I tried very hard to find when that started, and I don't think I found it even in the 15th century, even though there was clearly a reading test. Very hard to pin down, because obviously the records aren't going to tell you, Cisus Legit or Clericus. And the law reports help a little bit, because we find cases of people who can read a word here and a word, or a letter here and a letter there. Judges are egging you on. We'll allow that in other cases where they say that's a bit glib, we'll sign you another passage. So there probably was an element of discretion. Even in the 17th century, there was an element of discretion. So. But there isn't actually any 14th century evidence that you've come across that throws light on that. No.
Obviously, your sample's quite small, but I just wondered if you'd, in any of the cases of a wife murdering her husband, they were characterised as petty treason.
Yes, they were. The majority of women who murdered their husbands were acquitted. I have one who was found to be culpable. It wasn't. There's no mention of the words petty treason, but her punishment is burning.
Yeah, and but it doesn't say Philonicae Predatoria.
No, it reads as a normal homicide case, exactly the same. It said that she needlessly killed. No mention of treason.
Yeah.
You just get the treatment and punishment.
Right. Okay.
It's,
so it is
she's going to
actually,
be burned rather than that.
Yeah.
Yes.
because the cases, again, obviously the samples are very small, but the cases I've come across in 15th century, early 15th century, do have that. Typically that would, but as I say, it's only talking about handling.
Please.
I just wanted to ask you, thanks for the paper, by the way. I just wanted to ask something you mentioned quite early on about the struggles that social historians have had to use these records, and the whole business of suspicion, and why you think certain people do get indicted, or at least why the whole process has started against certain people and not others.
Yeah. So, I mean, when dealing with criminal statistics, we have sort of a sliding scale between the case being absolutely representative of what happened in real life. That person did it in the way that it's described. Or we have the other extreme, that it's a sort of conspiracy, trying to take down somebody in the community that we don't like, that's on prejudice. And we sort of have to negotiate on that sliding scale, and probably most of the time we're somewhere in the middle. The reason that I want to treat these records as fictive but not fictional, I don't think that there's widespread conspiracies to indict certain people and take down members of the community. Just from an economic standpoint, it doesn't make sense because most of the people they indict don't have any chapels recorded. So I don't think, I wouldn't advocate going down the route of this is all prejudiced conspiracy, they're taking down their enemies and people they don't like. The reason that I argue that we should treat them as fictive is because most of the time it's very clear that nobody saw what went on. So the jury are getting together and they're looking at the body and then they're coming up with their best guess of what they think happened. So they might be basing that on rumour, on gossip, on what they know about that person and their relationship. But I don't, without some forensic evidence, surveillance, whether we can put too much sway on these guesses. There's a case where somebody was murdered inside a shop, the body's discovered and the shop owner has fled. So They come up with this big elaborate story that there was an argument over the clothes that the person was wearing, and they got into this big fight, and then the murder took place, and then the shop owner fled. And I was just like, this is a lot of detail. So you see only two people who were there. One is dead and one has fled. So we don't have any first-hand evidence, but we've got all this sort of rich detail about what happened. So this is why I would go sort of best guesses with storytelling along, rather than treating these as accurate representations of medieval crime. I think it's very dangerous to start building sort of criminal profiles, saying criminals look like this, this, and this, or crime happened in this way, based on these stories that we see. And that feeds into the acquittal rates. And the acquittal rates are terribly high. And presumably they unravel this at court. There's no witnesses. How do you know that happened? Is it a case of 2 and 2 equaling 5? Sounds like a plausible story, but when you sort of pull at it and interrogate it, there's not much evidence to support the story that the coroner's jury are telling.
So would you say that there's any sense of what kinds of evidence might or might not be sort of usable? I mean, by the 15th century, there are yearbook discussions of this, of what constitutes grounds of suspicion, and fame and various kinds of circumstantial evidence. But is that, do you think that's a sort of established set of rules, or it's being worked out?
I don't know. It's my honest answer. My sense of looking at the type of people that are indicted, there doesn't seem to be, as I said, they're not targeting people for economic reasons. I've looked at the percentage of people who seem to be from somewhere else in England and seem to be from overseas, and they're not overrepresented. Certainly the ones from overseas, they're in line with the immigrant population that we would expect at this time. So there's no sort of real suggestion that anyone's being targeted based on their social status, ethnicity, economic status, any of these things. There's no real evidence that that's what they're doing. But as for how they record stuff out, I'm not entirely sure whether the evidence is to this period. I'm not looking into that. Thank
you. Something you said at the beginning has got me thinking as well about it'd be interesting to know more about monks claiming clergy, because I never really thought about it, but most monks, I take it, were not clerks of orders, at least not in major orders. And if monks could claim clergy, then who are not clerks, then I don't see any reason at all why nuns shouldn't, because their religion is in the same way.
Have you got any monk murderers?
Not friars.
Even less likely to be clerks.
No, they're mainly, just described as clerks or chaplains, vicars come up, rectors come up, some friars. I don't think I've got monks. Let's double check it.
Do we have any more questions or comments in the room, or anybody online? If you wouldn't mind raising your little yellow hand if you have a question or a comment. Tim, did I see one from you, or was that? No.
Yes, actually.
Yes. Perfect. Oh, okay, perfect. Please go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I seem to be getting echo. Is that echo intolerable?
We're not receiving it on our end. It could just be through the feedback. If you'd like to type your question, I'd be happy to read it if that's easier.
No, it's just a quick comment, really. Following up on the question of the reading test, I found the 1383 case of a priest being indicted for teaching a defendant to read really interesting, because presumably that's not just teaching reading, but teaching Latin. It seemed to me that was good evidence that even if it wasn't the neck verse, they were using a known text rather than choosing one at random. So I just wondered if there were any more examples of that type of indictment.
Yeah, I haven't looked extensively for them. That was one that I borrowed from somebody else's work. It's from historiography rather than my own research. But yeah, it's certainly worth following that up and seeing if that gives us any more detail on what they were being asked to read. Yeah, if you're sort of training somebody to read Latin in a jail cell, I mean, maybe you're expecting a set text.
But that's a good point, but he wouldn't have to understand the Latin, would he? As long as he
of
knew how
course,
to
no.
pronounce it.
And presumably you don't have to use some official classical or English pronunciation.
I think I think they were always using the Bible, but just not necessarily.
It was the Psalter, eventually, yes. But whether it was always a Psalter, it just doesn't say in the records, does it?
No.
Do we have any more questions or comments from our online attendees? Any more in the room?
Well, just a quick point about women judges. You mentioned earlier on, he said there's some sort of theological explanation being produced as to why women couldn't be judges because of delegation from God through men or something. But I wonder if that isn't a sort of thinking history backwards from the fact that women weren't judges, and so there must have been some explanation. But in fact, the readers in the Inns of Court in the 15th century were always very fond of saying that women can be justices of the peace, and then they raise these questions of can a woman commit her own husband to prison? and they cite examples. I think I'm pretty sure I found one of them, but there was an example of a woman justice. They're pretty rare, mind you, but I think there was an example once. And so presumably it wasn't actually impossible, it just didn't happen. For social reasons, I suppose, as much as anything.
Yeah.
And also the possibility that they might be asked to commit their husbands to prison.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, obviously it's the question of how cases start and which cases are taken forward against who. Maybe thinking about this in relation to future larger project and also more generally. But we do have information about where these offences are alleged to happen, don't we, in some cases.
Yes, from cases, yeah, about a tiny percentage, so less than 10%. Let's say exactly where it took place. So I've got houses and fields or in the street. But normally, no. If it's in the city of York, I almost always get a street name, but we don't know whether it's out in the street or whether it's in a building on the street. When it's outside of York, I just get the name of the village. I don't even know whereabouts it happened. There's no more detail than that. And the suggestion that when the specific locations included, that is there for a reason. The jury are trying to make a statement. Murders happening in homes are particularly heinous because you're sort of invading the domestic space. Or murders on the King's Highway are particularly heinous, and breaching the King's peace, and laying in wait, attacking travellers. So there's certainly a suggestion of when this information is being included. It's not just a neutral, oh, this is where it happens. They're trying to add another layer and send a message to the trial jury that this is a particularly heinous killing. It's not an accident that they're recording where it took place.
The other thing, a small point was, you mentioned you're talking about the clergy who weren't described as such, and so there were two. You only gave the Buckingham case.
Yeah.
Was the other one not interesting? What was the other nature of the
So
other
the
one?
other one was followed the same sort of sacred format. So when he was first introduced, you just get his name without any indication that he's a cleric. And then as it goes on, then he to the extent that the clergy,
There's the same, bit more detail.
this is the same, yes, pretty much the same as that, so I didn't go through the two.
Sure.
Then I had one additional question. This, you might have mentioned this and I might have just missed it. In regards to the examples when the plural was used in these cases of coverture you were speaking about, was this being used both in instances in which the husband was the accused and the wife, or was this only when the wife was the accused?
So all the cases where the plural was used, both the husband and the wife are being indicted together. I don't have any examples of married women being indicted without their husband and owning chattels. So all the married women who appear without their husband, who haven't killed their husbands, they are still properly married women, are just recorded as having no chattels. But I don't, the point I'm making is that's not necessarily unusual. We can't take that as proof of she has no chattels because of coverture, because the majority of men also have no chattels. So
That's the case you have to find, isn't it?
that's the case, yeah.
Because then the husband would stand to lose any
Yeah.
rights he had.
Yes. Unfortunately, there's a very difficult task, either based on real female criminality or at least perceptions of female criminality. Women are often indicted with their husbands, or they kill their husband.
Fantastic. Final call for questions in the room or online.
Just on that, I mean, is there any notion, and this is ignorance, but is there any notion that there is any movables, residual or attached to the woman that she has, the life, that she has special, not just control over, but ownership of, in this kind of setting? I mean, there are some ideas kicking around in this respect for probate, relating to paraphernalia and clothing, jewellery, like. But in a kind of common law setting, is that relevant at all? I mean, could that explain the there?
Could do,
Well,
yeah.
Well, she wouldn't forfeit the clothes she was wearing, I assume, going a bit too far.
Well, I mean,
Well, after execution, I suppose,
Rather than forfeit,
they
it's
could seize whatever she was wearing, yes. It's worth.
But it may be a simple enrolling practice that you've got to say what the chattels were of the convict, even if there were none.
Yes.
It would be aorum if it was the husband and wife being indicted together.
But then, of course, the other option is to say that he had X chattels and she had none.
Yeah. So,
Because they do that with suspects who are not married, they list them separately rather than listing them together.
yeah.
Um,
But then that does show there is a different perception between property holding of husband and wife and property holding of unconnected people.
Yes, possibly. Yeah, they're listed separately. Unconnected people are listed separately when they have chattels. When they don't have chattels, they're listed together.
So it's
Sort
simply
of John
a-
Adler that have no chattels. But yes, when they have chattels, they're listed separately because they come from separate households and their chattels are separate. We don't both own those goods.
you need more cases.
Yes.
Yeah.
Another 10,000.
The problem with mine is that I only have total valuations. I don't know what the chattels are. There you go. That looks like it's hers and that looks like it's his. I just have a fraction of the chattels.
Although one of those cases you talked about, wasn't saddle.
One, yeah. Very, yeah, we can do a whole sample. Don't know why. Valuations.
Well, fantastic. We'll give one more thank you to Steph for an absolutely wonderful time. And we will be back a week from today with our third seminar of term. So thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you there.
Extra answer to the time.